Hello and welcome to week 9 of plant biology here at NICC. Uh, there's going to be a fair bit of reading this week. We are covering sexual reproduction in plants, and so we're going to be reading in chapters 7 and 8 of concepts of biology. So chapter 7 is really the cellular basis of inheritance, and chapter 8 is then patterns of inheritance. So why do organisms reproduce in the ways that they do, and how does that work at a cellular level. And then chapter 32 in biology 2E is the sort of second or third part of the reading, depending on how you look at it, and that is really looking at plant reproduction specifically. So in concepts of biology, 7 and 8 should give you a good sort of grounding reading for how sexual reproduction is going to move forward in the general sense. And then the biology 2E reading, chapter 32, will give you more specifics about plants. Okay, so chapter 7 is the cellular basis of inheritance. So if you want to review sort of just how cells reproduce and divide in general, you can go back to chapter 6 of concepts of biology, but I'm not going to assign that specifically. We're just going to keep moving forward. And so chapter 7, we're going to be looking at the cellular basis of inheritance. So we're really looking at how do cells divide and split up when it comes to reproductive events. So what we see with plants is somewhat different than with animals. And figure 7.2 in concepts of biology does a really good job of separating out how these different sorts of organisms really have different reproductive structures in it. And for that matter, the figure also separates out fungi, which reproduce differently than both plants and animals. But what we see is this development of what are called gametes, and the different sorts of strategies employed by both plants, and then comparing that to the fungi and the animals. And that's a good way to think about it, because I think most everybody's fairly familiar with how animals reproduce, being that humans are animals, and you probably have had some exposure to that, but maybe not necessarily have any exposure in how plants reproduce. And in some ways, that plant reproduction strategy is very different than with the animal reproductive strategy. In the end, it's all about producing gametes, which have half the genetic material as the parent, but how they go about to produce those gametes is somewhat different. So we have this development of what is called the gametophyte and the sporophyte generations, and both of those life stages perform vital and critical parts of the life cycle of plants, but depending on what type of plant we're talking about will determine sort of which part of the plant is the dominant phase. For some plants, the gametophyte generation is the dominant stage. So when you're looking at moss, for example, the green fluffy stuff that you usually see, that's the gametophyte generation. If you look at a tree, that's the sporophyte generation. And so we see this shift during the evolutionary processes away from a gametophyte generation dominant lifestyle to a sporophyte dominant lifestyle when we're moving sort of forward through evolution. That's not to say that mosses are not successful. They're an incredibly successful group of organisms and play critical ecological roles, but they do have certain limitations that we don't see with these organisms as they develop the sporophyte generation dominance. All right, so regardless of whether this is a sporophyte or a gametophyte dominant plant, we're still going to be producing gametes. And these gametes are important because they provide a pathway for plants to reproduce sexually. When organisms are able to reproduce sexually, we get higher diversity because they're just different. And so this diversity in organisms is important from an evolutionary concept, because as we have diversity, we have the ability to better withstand environmental change. And really, when we're talking about evolution, the ability to withstand environmental change and continue to reproduce, that is really the key for success when we're talking about evolution. So when we say survival of the fittest, that doesn't mean the biggest or the strongest. That means the individuals who can push their genes into the next generation are the fittest. And when we're looking at meiosis, we're building that ability to reproduce sexually, and that, generally speaking, makes for more fit organisms. And so we get this advantage with sexual reproduction that we don't get with asexual reproduction because of meiosis and the splitting and division and recombination of the genetic material of the plant's parents. All right. So in meiosis, we have division of the cell along with reduction of the number of chromosomes. So we're moving from the number of chromosomes from the 2N condition to the 1N condition. So we're splitting the homologous pairs of chromosomes from one another and then dividing the replicated chromosomes as we go through these steps. We'll go through these steps briefly, and again, if you need to go back and review sort of general mitosis, go back and look at chapter 6, specifically 6.2 talks about the cell cycle and should again be able to provide some additional background on just general cell division. But for this reading here, we're talking about meiosis, or the division of cells for the production of gametes. The first step along the way in meiosis is again this interphase step where the cell is simply existing. When we go through this process of interphase, the cell just is sort of preparing for division. And when we are going through meiosis, so M-E-I-O-S-I-S, meiosis, not mitosis, we get a different sort of division where we have two different distinct stages. The first step, thankfully, is called meiosis 1, and the second is simply called meiosis 2. So we get these two discrete cell division events in meiosis, which is different than mitosis, where you get full replication or duplication, replication, and division all in one set. With meiosis, we have this additional divisional step which splits apart the numbers of chromosomes, so we move from a 2N condition of the cell into a 1N condition of the cell. So, in the first step of meiosis 1, we start out and we really are just getting the cells to be able to remove half of the genetic complement from one another. And so if we're looking through this process and we're looking at figure 7.4, we're going to see that in this first meiotic division, it's going to go through these same named steps as the mitotic division, but the differences are, there's the significant differences in this first step, this meiosis 1 step. So you have the replicated chromosomes pairing up with their homologous pair along the metaphasic plate, whereas in mitosis you get the replicated pairs lining up not necessarily with the homologous pair. So you get the replicated chromosomes lining up and then splitting, as opposed to in meiosis 1 where you have the homologous pairs of the chromosomes lining up and splitting. And so when we get this pairing of the homologous chromosomes and then the splitting of them, this is really where we get the reduction in the numbers of chromosomes of the individual. And this is a key step in meiosis, in this reducing of the numbers of chromosomes. The second stage of meiosis is meiosis 2, and here we have, again, similar to mitosis, we have the splitting of these sister chromatids in these cells that are already 1N. And so you end up with 1, 2, and then 3, and then 4 gametes, each with 1 copy of the chromosomes. And so we're ending up with 4 cells that are 1N rather than 2 cells that are 2N. And so this is a big difference between meiosis and mitosis. And so as you're going through, working through these differences, I think this chapter does a good job also of comparing the differences between meiosis and mitosis, because it really is an important division, and this first meiotic divisional step is critical for the development of gametes. So spend some time going through chapter 7, and then that should get you a good basic understanding of what meiosis is. Alright, so that's very basics of meiosis. So going through the text, go through chapter 7, get a good understanding of meiosis. Now, putting meiosis in action in a sort of biological sense, we can look at Chapter 8 and we can see how these meiotic divisions influence the genetic traits of offspring based on the genetics of their parents. And a great example of this is the work of Gregor Mendel, and he's a very important sort of precursor to genetics, and his work was completely underappreciated, but really in looking back through it with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that much of his work and understanding was right on point. But his work was done in the middle 1800s, but it was a way of showing that organisms have these pieces of information called genes and DNA that they're moving through generation, but they're doing so in an organized and orderly fashion. So although they are in some cases random as far as the arrangement of the chromosomes, there is this very discrete way in which it is done, and that makes for interesting patterns that have been time tested and sort of approved as it were as an explanation of how this process works, moving from meiosis into the actual development of our understanding and laws of how this genetic material moves from one generation to the next. All right, when we're talking about how the genetics of an organism influences what an organism looks like, we're talking about the difference between genotype and phenotype. The genotype is the genetic information. So what do the genes code for? And then what that genetic information, how that is expressed in an individual, is the phenotype. So the phenotype is how an organism looks. The genotype is what its genetics are. And most organisms that we can look at are going to have not necessarily this blending of traits, but we're going to have these sorts of dominant and recessive traits that are going to be expressed in preference to one another. And that, again, is going to be reliant on the genotype, which will then express as the phenotype. So as you're going through, we're going to look through and we're going to see that we can have homozygous individuals for traits, and we can have heterozygous individuals for traits, and so understand what those terms mean and how they reflect in the genotype and the phenotype. We're going to definitely see that dominant traits are going to be expressed over recessive traits, and that's going to be pretty much true for all things. There are always exceptions, but for the most part, that's always true. And we can predict how these traits are going to be expressed if we know the genotype of an individual. We can use what's called a Punnett square and predict what the probabilities would be for these traits to be expressed based on their genotypes. Alternately, you can use that Punnett square if you know the phenotype of an individual and you can look at the phenotype of the offspring. You can make some good guesses as to what the genotype of the parents was, and that's using what's called a test cross to check it's a way of sort of checking your math basically in a genetic sense. But when we're going through and looking at these laws of inheritance that really began our understanding with Mendel's work, we can see that these laws of inheritance are really based on our good solid understanding of these meiotic divisions and understanding how these chromosomes are separating during cell division and building this predictable yet random sort of probabilities if you have enough of the offspring to look at. So it's a really important concept, and looking at how these traits are expressed based on the genotypes. Now, not all traits are one gene, one trait. In fact, most traits are multi-gene, and so when we're getting to the end of Chapter 8, 8.3, we can look at these sort of, I'll say, alternates to dominance and recessives. So we can have incomplete dominance or codominance. Maybe there are multiple alleles that code for these traits, but again, these are all differences on this variation of this theme that are linked to meiosis. All right, that's Chapter 7 and 8. I'm going to put up another lecture for Chapter 32, and so I'll talk to you guys later.